So the title of the seminar is Clashing Temporalities, which describes it quite nicely because it's kind of the bringing together, the clashing of all of the different lengths of time that are all coming together and playing a part in what we now see as the Mississippi River system. So it's everything from 7,000 years of a meander sweeping its way across the landscape, all the way up to the dredging that happened yesterday, and today, an hour ago. So it's all of these systems that are happening on different timescales. Some of them consistently, some of them one-off events, like where the river has changed its course and built the delta. So we kind of bring together these contrasting systems and contrasting times so that we can begin to explore this really temporally complex system. I'm a sedimentologist, so I've been studying river systems particularly for about 6 years, and the Mississippi is a fascinating one because of the amount of data that's been collected on it, as well as just the size of it, the sheer scale and the number of lives that it touches and impacts.
And I think for me, just the themes of time and sediment, and thinking about how these different time scales interact with human time scales, and the way that the ways that the river has changed over its length of time have influenced the way that people have been able to live here in this region and try to struggle to live in this region, and kind of that clash of the human scale and the river scale, and the ways that the river has wanted to change its course and the way that humans have tried to stop the river from changing its course. And so sort of that grappling between the human time scale and the river time, and how sediment and the movement of sediment has fit into all of that as well. And I'm trained as a coastal scientist, oceanography and coastal science, but my work now is very centered on how the environment and environmental change affect humans, and essentially how the conundrum we find ourselves in of how we're going to live as coastal people. And so that's why I'm drawn to this work and to this seminar. And I just want to say that Bruce Sampai Barnes, who isn't here with us today, is also working with us, and he's been really crucial in envisioning the seminar. And he's a natural scientist. He's trained as a natural scientist, and he's also a musician. And Rebecca asked him to be part of the seminar, kind of thinking about not only his science background and the music and the human piece. He's an ethnographer as well, but also like how he kind of musical time fits into this as well. So we're hoping to weave music into the day as well. I would say, well, we're going to start out on Monday tomorrow, going to Pierre Part, Louisiana, which is a town that's within the influence of the Morganza spillway. And so there's an influence there there's this structure that's been put in place that floods this community or nearby this community in order to save other places along the river. And so it's like a very stark representation of a place that it's surrounded by water. It's very watery. Actually, this summer there was a lot of flooding there. And so just this idea of how the movement of the river and how people are able to try to struggle to live with that. And so we're going to be speaking with some folks that live there and thinking about how the living with the river has affected their lives and the lives of their ancestors and their community. So we're going to be having some discussions with them, and I think Bruce is going to weave some music into the day as well. He's really good at doing that, and I think we're going to try to come up with some songs as a group throughout the 2 days, so I think that'll be really fun. And then we're going to visit the Laura Plantation, and I don't actually even like to use the word plantation anymore. It was a forced labor camp, and I think it's hard to have these conversations. It's right along the river, and it's hard to have a conversation about the relationship between people and the river in the context of this seminar on the Anthropocene without talking about the forced labor camps, the plantations, and how the labor of people along the river and the stories. There's some really fundamental kind of folk tales and stories that came out of the community of people that lived at Laura, kind of how that culturally weaves into some of the other themes that we're talking about. So we're going to do that on Monday, and then on Tuesday, Catherine's going to lead us in really delving into more of the geological pieces of it.
Yeah. So we're going to start the day going to the Louisiana State University River Institute, River Studies Institute. So what we're going to do is look at the river model, which is it's both for like science and research and also public outreach to try to communicate some of the challenges that the community is facing, as well as try to do experiments to predict future challenges as well. So we're going to be really lucky because hopefully the flume will be actually running an experiment while we're there, and we're going to be kind of looking at it in a deeper time sense. So we're going to start with looking at what it is now and what is kind of the challenges now and the challenges in the future on the model. And then we're going to go and talk about some of the past in the classroom. So I've been studying the False River Point bar sediments, and there were some cores which one of the wonderful students from Louisiana State University is going to bring over for us to have a look at, so we can actually see the vertical changes of the sand and the mud over time as it's been built up by the river, when it was a much more natural system and actually changing its shape and moving around the landscape rather than the fixed state that we have it in now. And so we're going to look at this core and ask questions about, how is time represented, not just from side to side where we can see these beautiful Fisk images of the river, but also how it changes by depth and how we can get all of that into one story. And then after that, we're going to go see where we took the core from. So we're going to go and have a look at the sheer scale of this river, and just have a look at how big this lake is, and what's going into that lake now. Is it still sand and mud, or are we getting some anthropogenic sediments like plastic and, old razor blades, and whatever ends up in these systems? Fishing lines are a big one. And then we come home, I think, and then on Wednesday.
Yeah, I mean, so part of the kind of cohesion that comes from these two sites is that Pierre Part is in the Atchafalaya Basin, so without the kind of river engineering that occurs above where Catherine works, the risk is, Catherine's the expert on this, but I have some sense of it, that the river will avulse and cross over into the Atchafalaya Basin. So the whole kind of, the two sites in some way have a relation, and this kind of brings in this idea that the hydrogeomorphology, the kind of work that Catherine works on from a kind of natural scientific basis, also has a strong human element that she explores in her work, and that Amy and Bruce are kind of well aware of, thanks to their knowledge of the local history. And it's really, as a historian, it's really apparent that really very early on with colonial settlement, you have Bienville, who was considered the founder of the city of New Orleans, and very early on, around 1719, the first kind of boatload of people from Senegal, enslaved people that he brought to the city, were put to work building levees, and they were not just put to work as labourers, they were experts, because in Senegal there was a lot of kind of irrigation work done there, and so they had expertise that was able to help sustain the city. They were also experts in rice cultivation, so there's a real sense in which the kind of human history of the area has a direct relation to the hydrogeomorphology at the same time, from 1700s onwards, but obviously long before that with indigenous peoples of the region. And we had Monique Verdun tell us that the original name of this area is Bobuncha, which is the city of many voices, or place of many voices, sorry. And with that kind of description of the place, you get the sense in which even before colonial settlement, there were these layers of human engagement in this area, in this site. So I think this relationship between human sedimentation and river sedimentation is apparent wherever you look for it on this site.
Yeah, so I feel like we have these themes of different timescales: the human timescale, the geologic timescale, river time, water, sediment, the layers, and I feel like we're starting out kind of with this human historical context and on human timescales and moving to the geological timescale, and I think we're going to try to weave those together throughout the 2 days, the 2.5 days.
Because we need to understand, what the river would naturally do, what it would, how it would naturally behave in the landscape without that human influence, to then have a look and see what the difference is. So we have to have, one with the other, and that's kind of the temporality clash that we're trying to summarize.
Yeah.
Trying to summarize. So there are a couple of things. One of which is, as I mentioned before, we have a new sediment, plastic. So ultimately, we've found that in most of the environments that we've investigated in the world, and so we know that it is pervasive. We know that we have this new sediment type. So that is one way in which we're, coming forwards in a broad context with the Anthropocene and sedimentology. And we don't really understand the impacts of that yet either. So I think we'll investigate that in the seminar. The other thing as well is that the sea level is rising, climate is changing, and ultimately when you do that, you change the weather patterns, and because much of what we encounter in terms of sedimentology on a day-to-day life is on the land, so delta and river systems and deserts and things like that. So as soon as you start changing the climate, you're changing how these patterns are going to develop and how these systems are going to behave. So if you're, for example, increasing rainfall, then you'll be increasing flood events and that sort of thing. And the way that it will occur on a planetary scale is if you're going to have more rain somewhere, then somewhere else is probably in drought. And this whole, the complex interplay of all of these changes is something that we're only really just beginning to understand and make predictions of that into the future, where it's going to become very complicated and important to foresee some of these challenges.
And I think too, we were listening to one of the members of the Anthropocene working group talking this morning about all the threats to different deltas around the world, and I think culturally there are just these very precious, rich cultures around in river deltas around the world, and these deltas are threatened for reasons that are, that Catherine talked about, and sea level rise, and also the sediment, starving them of sediment. And so I think for us here living in New Orleans, we think about the links that we have to other both historic, ancient, and current delta regions, and the cultures and the livelihoods that people live there, and how those, along with the deltas themselves, those are threatened, and how we're going to make sense of all that, and how are the cultures themselves and the peoples that live there are going to migrate or survive or change or evolve and thrive. And so those are some questions we have to think about, linking all these many large deltas around the world.
Yeah, and from my kind of historical perspective, the interesting kind of relation between this site and the planetary comes from the designation of the Anthropocene. So Eugene Sturmer and Paul Crutzen proposed in the year 2000 that perhaps the starting point of the Anthropocene was the invention of the steam engine in Watt's steam engine in 1780. But there wasn't much consideration as to what that steam engine was doing, and that steam engine in the mills of Manchester and in London a lot of the time was processing cotton, and this cotton was coming from the rich alluvial soil that the river was depositing, and the expertise of enslaved people was involved in processing. So it's this kind of what can be thought of in terms of teleconnections, but in kind of human historical teleconnections between the kind of depositional processes of the river, the histories of colonial enslavement of peoples, and then industrialization in urban centers of Western Europe, that I think begins to bring out these chains of causation that has resulted in the kind of shifts in global and planetary dynamics that we see today.
here.
All good. Go ahead. Thank you.
We asked the people who are going to be participating in the seminar to do some writing beforehand, and those are coming in and they're really rich. And I'm really excited to have a dialogue between us conveners and the seminar participants. And I'm not sure exactly what products we're going to have, whether it be songs or writing or both or discussion, but I'm really excited to have dialogue and to see what the people who are participating in the seminar can bring, and in addition to the experts and the community member experts that we're going to be talking to. So I think I can't really predict what our outcomes are going to be, because I think they're going to be a product of those interactions that we all have, and I'm really excited to see what the 40 or so people who are coming are going to bring, and the people that we've invited to speak with us. So I think it remains to be seen for me, but I'm looking forward to a really fertile dialogue.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of experimental. I think there's a lot of talk about how in the age of the Anthropocene we have to think about earth sciences from a kind of humanities perspective, and whether that's arts and culture or whether that's history. And it's more often kind of stated than done in practice, so it's an opportunity to actually see if we can talk about sedimentation from the perspective of human history, and use human history then to talk about earth system processes. So yeah, I'm excited.
I think there's a really important relationship that I'd like the participants to understand, which is that the river isn't just for taking resources from, it's also to, it's a relationship, and there needs to be a compromise struck between what the river wants to do and what we're asking of it. So we need to start up that kind of conversation again, I suppose, in that, yes, there are loads of human changes and impacts that we've had on the river system, and those are our modern temporalities, and these are the challenges that we're facing at the moment, and this is how the river is interacting with us, but how are we interacting with the river back, and just that kind of that to and fro relationship of how we're kind of living with this unpredictable, beast that's been put in a box. It's a dynamic system that is very much alive, and I just really hope that we can bring to the foreground this history that we have, and also the modern challenges as well. And I have no idea how it's going to go. I'm sure the conversation will meander.
Like the river.
Just like the river.